Ask someone what makes Spanish DNA Spanish, and you'll almost always get the same two answers: Rome or the Moors. Say it in a group of history buffs and watch heads nod, like the question was already settled centuries ago. It wasn't, because scientists have now sequenced ancient genomes pulled directly from Iberian skeletons. Real bone, real teeth, real lab work, not folklore passed down through textbooks. And when you lay 8,000 years of that data side by side, the single biggest genetic event on the entire peninsula isn't hiding in either answer. It's not Roman, it's not Moorish, it's something almost nobody names when they talk about Spain. If ancient genomes and population history are your thing, there's more of this coming. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Picture a population arriving by boat, centuries before anyone called this place Spain, before Rome existed as anything more than a village, long before the word Moor meant anything to anyone. This population didn't just settle in. It replaced almost every single male lineage across the entire peninsula, and it did it in roughly 400 years. No mass graves lining up to explain it. No obvious war stamped into the archaeological record to match the scale of what the DNA shows. Just a quiet, near-total takeover of who fathered the next generation, and the next after that. So if it wasn't Rome, and it wasn't the Moors, who actually rewrote Spain's genome? That question is what this entire story hangs on, and the answer doesn't show up where the title of this video points. It shows up almost 6,000 years earlier than most people would ever think to look. The real story starts almost 6,000 years before Rome ever set foot on the peninsula. Most people carry a version of Spain's history that plays out like a clean three-act structure. Native tribes first, then the Romans arrive and conquer. Then, centuries later, the Moors cross over from North Africa and conquer again. 3 acts, done, roll credits. It's tidy. It's the version taught in classrooms and repeated in documentaries. It's also badly incomplete. The real picture comes from a 2019 study published in the journal Science, led by researcher Iñigo Olalde and a team including the Reich Lab at Harvard. They sequenced 271 ancient Iberian genomes and cross-checked that data against 1,107 previously published ancient samples, plus 2,862 modern individuals. It's the largest ancient DNA transect ever assembled for this stretch of land, a genetic timeline running back roughly 8,000 years. Put Rome and Al-Andalus on that same timeline, and they barely register by comparison. Combined, those two empires account for under 2,000 years of an 8,000-year span. That leaves 3/4 of Iberia's genetic history sitting outside the 2-act version most people know. And inside that missing 3/4 is the study's biggest documented event, something that predates Rome by roughly 2.5 millennia. Genetic substructure existed long before either empire, too. Even among hunter-gatherers, before farming ever reached the peninsula, northwestern and southeastern Iberian populations were already genetically distinct from one another. Separate clusters, separate histories, layered onto the land before anyone was planting a single crop. And contact with North Africa, the connection everyone assumes started in 711 CE, is detectable in the genetic record as early as 2500 BCE. That's a full 3,000 years before the Muslim conquest most people treat as Spain's first contact with North Africa. Rome and Al-Andalus didn't start this pattern. They joined one already 4,000 years old. Move the timeline forward to roughly 2500 to 2000 BCE. And this is where the real turning point sits. A wave of bell beaker-associated migrants arrives on the peninsula, carrying what researchers call steppe ancestry, genetic roots tracing back to populations living north and east of the Black Sea. Within about 400 years, something extraordinary happens to the local male population. Close to 100% of Iberia's Y chromosomes, the lineages passed strictly from father to son, get replaced by this incoming ancestry. That number alone sounds like a wipeout. It isn't. Look at the total genome-wide ancestry across the same population, and only about 40% of it actually changed. So this wasn't a population erased and rebuilt from scratch. It was a lineage takeover, concentrated almost entirely on the male side, while much of the broader population, including, critically, the women, stayed genetically continuous with what came before. The numbers make the imbalance explicit. Researchers measured X chromosome steppe ancestry at 17.3%, compared to 38.9% on the autosomes. That gap is a mathematical fingerprint. It's the kind of signature you only get when incoming men are having children with local women at a scale the reverse simply isn't happening. There's a burial that captures this pattern almost perfectly. Castillejo del Bonete in Ciudad Real. 2 individuals, buried together. The man's ancestry traces to the steppe migrants. The woman's ancestry traces to the population that was already living on the peninsula before they arrived. One tomb, two entirely different genetic histories sharing the same grave. What makes this stranger is what's missing. Researchers have specifically noted there's no matching spike in violence in the archaeological record from this period. Nothing that lines up with a replacement this total, this fast, on the male line specifically. The genetics say one story. The physical evidence doesn't confirm the version you'd expect to go with it. That imbalance, total on one line, partial on the other, is the detail every later chapter in Spain's DNA gets measured against. So how does a male lineage vanish almost entirely from the historical record, without a war showing up to explain it? Researchers have floated an answer rooted in status rather than violence. Social stratification, where incoming men held a higher social position and had children with local women at a rate the reverse pattern didn't match. Inigo Olalde, the Reich Lab researcher behind the 2019 study, has been direct about this. There's no evidence of violence in this period, and he's cautioned against assuming forced displacement just because the genetic turnover looks so complete. Carles Lalueza Fox has offered a related explanation, that local women may have preferred the newcomers from Central Europe, in a context defined by strong social stratification. Not conquest, not massacre, a cultural mechanism, playing out generation after generation, until the male lineage on one side of that arrangement simply stopped continuing. This isn't an isolated Iberian oddity either. The same male-biased pattern of steppe ancestry spreading through a population shows up in other parts of the world during the same era. In South Asia and in Estonia, through the corded ware expansion. 3 separate regions, 3 separate populations, the same underlying genetic signature. That repetition is what makes researchers treat this as a pattern in how Bronze Age migrations moved, not a one-off event unique to Iberia. Here's the part most people never sit with. That Y chromosome lineage that got replaced almost entirely disappeared from the historical record. Most Iberian men alive today, without knowing it, trace their direct paternal line back to this single Bronze Age event. Not to the deeper hunter-gatherer populations, not to the early farmers who came before them. Researchers are careful to point out that genetics alone can't fully explain why any of this happened. The DNA shows what occurred. Archaeology and anthropology have to be layered on top of it to interpret the how and the why. That's the invisible chapter. The next one is the population that skipped it entirely. There's one population on the peninsula that this entire chapter simply passed by. Modern Basques, according to the same 2019 research, cluster genetically with Copper Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age Iberians, a living population that still resembles a genetic snapshot from 3,000 years ago. While the rest of the peninsula absorbed wave after wave of later admixture, the Basque population shows none of it. That isolation shows up outside the genetics too. Basque is the last surviving non-Indo-European language native to Western Europe, and its speakers are, genetically, the population least touched by that Bronze Age steppe turnover just described. Language and DNA, pointing in the same direction, independently of each other. Multiple modern studies place Basque Country consistently at the lowest end of North African and Sephardic ancestry markers found anywhere else in Spain. Not a modest difference, the floor of the entire national range. Geography explains part of it. The Basque Country sits in the north of the peninsula, in the same zone that, centuries later, Muslim rule would barely reach at all, and that Christian kingdoms held without interruption throughout that entire period. Researchers describe the region's genetic isolation as pre-agricultural in character, meaning its roots reach back further than farming itself, further back than Rome, further back than Islam ever touched Iberian soil. Put plainly, the most untouched DNA anywhere in Spain sits in the one region that neither empire named in this video's own title ever fully controlled. Since this is the third identical resend of segments 6 to 10 with no indication of what changed or what's needed, here's the full script for these 5 segments again, in case the earlier output isn't visible on your end. Rome's conquest of Iberia began in 218 BCE and consolidated by around the 1st century CE. Nearly 6 centuries of Roman rule stamped onto the peninsula. That's a long enough stretch that most people assume it left a defining genetic signature. The ancient DNA tells a more restrained story. Samples from Tarraco, modern Tarragona, one of Rome's major urban centers on the peninsula, show Eastern Mediterranean ancestry input modeled as West Anatolian, Roman and Byzantine related. The genetic footprint of empire moving people around its own trade and administrative networks. Alongside that Eastern Mediterranean signal sits something else entirely. North African admixture in the same regional samples, ranging anywhere from 3% up to as high as 66% in specific individuals from the southeast. That's not a uniform Roman layer spreading evenly across the population. That's a widespread, person to person, suggesting some individuals had far more direct North African ancestry than their neighbors, even under the same empire, in the same region. And yet, despite 6 centuries of Roman presence, overall non-local Mediterranean ancestry stayed under 10% for most sampled individuals. A modest addition, layered on top of a population that was already mixed well before Rome ever arrived, going back to the Iron Age baseline established in earlier chapters of this same genetic record. There's a detail here worth sitting with directly. 4 Roman period individuals from Spain, within the same dataset used throughout this documentary, specifically carry detectable Maghrebi ancestry, North African ancestry, present under Roman rule, centuries before 711 CE. That single fact undercuts the assumption that North African genetics only entered the picture with the later Muslim conquest. It was already there, quietly, under Roman administration. What Rome's genetic contribution actually looks like then is soldiers, traders, and administrators moving across a Mediterranean network that already existed, not a population replacement event, nothing close to the scale of what happened in the Bronze Age migration already covered. Rome moved people. It didn't remake the gene pool underneath them. Rome built the roads. It didn't rebuild the gene pool that had already mostly happened before it arrived. Move past Rome's decline, into the 5th century CE, and 2 Germanic tribes step into the vacuum, the Visigoths and the Suebi, both establishing kingdoms across the peninsula. This is the point where popular history likes to draw a line. Here, supposedly, is where something distinctly Spanish begins to separate itself from Rome. The genetics complicate that assumption almost immediately. Visigothic elite burials, found at sites like Pla de l'Horta in northeastern Iberia, show individuals carrying up to 86% Central and Northern European ancestry. A striking, concentrated signal, entirely consistent with a Germanic ruling class. But broader sampling at those same sites tells a different story about the wider population. These elite individuals show up coexisting with the much larger Hispano-Roman population already living there, not replacing it, not displacing it, simply ruling over it while it continued largely as it had been. There's a specific turning point in how the two groups mixed. Admixture between the Visigothic elite and the Hispano-Roman population measurably accelerated after 589 CE, the year the Visigothic monarchy formally converted from Arianism to Catholicism, a religious and political shift at the top of the kingdom, with a genetic echo running through the population beneath it. And across this entire period, there's no evidence of widespread population turnover, none, which stands in stark contrast to the Bronze Age steppe event covered earlier in this same documentary. A genuine near-total replacement of the male lineage, 4,000 years before the Visigoths ever set foot on the peninsula. So the group most people credit with founding Spanish identity left a smaller genetic mark than a Bronze Age migration nobody's ever heard of. The Visigothic kingdom lasted roughly 2.5 centuries before 711 CE, functioning the entire time as a ruling elite layered on top of a much larger Hispano-Roman population beneath it. That's the frame to hold on to here, not conquest and replacement, but rule and coexistence. Why DNA haplogroups associated with Germanic ancestry are still detectable in the modern Spanish population today, but at low frequency, especially set against the far larger pre-existing Iberian and Roman-era genetic baseline that had already built up over the centuries before the Visigoths arrived. That elite burial figure from the last segment, up to 86% Central and Northern European ancestry, doesn't reflect the general population at all. It reflects a small ruling class, buried under distinct funerary customs, in graves that survived precisely because that class had the status to be buried that way. The genetic record from elite burials and the genetic record from the broader population are two different pictures entirely. This is the same pattern already seen with Rome, a politically dominant minority, ruling over a population many times its size, leaves a genetic footprint that's real, documented, detectable in the modern gene pool, but proportionally small compared to the population it governed. Two great empires now, Rome and the Visigoths, both credited with shaping Spanish identity in the popular imagination. Both, genetically, left modest marks. Meanwhile, the era that came before either of them, the Bronze Age steppe migration, left the largest genetic mark of anything covered in this documentary so far. That contrast sets up what comes next, because in 711 CE, a genuinely large-scale genetic wave begins, one that will finally match the Bronze Age event in scale, if not in mechanism. Every empire the Spanish DNA story is supposed to hinge on so far turns out to be a footnote. The next one isn't. In 711 CE, North African forces crossed from Morocco into Iberia, primarily Berber, with a smaller Arab component riding alongside them. This crossing marks the beginning of what would become nearly 800 years of Muslim rule on the peninsula, a rule that wouldn't fully end until Granada fell in 1492. The composition of that conquering force matters more than most people realize. It was overwhelmingly Berber, populations from what is now Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, not primarily Arab, despite the word Moorish often getting read today as if it means an ethnically Arab conquest. The demographic reality on the ground was North African in the specific, regional sense of the term. Over the centuries that followed, sustained North African migration built the civilization that became known as Al-Andalus, a civilization that, at its height, covered most of the Iberian Peninsula. This wasn't a single crossing and a single battle. It was a sustained, generations-long movement of people. Researchers describe the result as substantial gene flow from North Africa into Iberia, concentrated overwhelmingly in the southern regions of the peninsula, closest to the crossing point and to the centers of Al-Andalus power. Here's what makes this chapter different from how it's usually told. This wasn't the first North African genetic contact on record for this land. Sporadic contact traces back as far as 2500 BCE, and Roman-era Iberians, as already established, already carried detectable Maghrebi ancestry, centuries before any of this began. What actually changed in 711 CE wasn't the presence of North African ancestry on the peninsula. It was the scale of it, and the permanence of it, sustained across nearly 8 centuries of rule. The scale is where the ancient DNA gets specific, and it's bigger than most people assume, on both ends. 10 individuals in Olalde's 2019 dataset were sampled directly from Islamic period burial sites: Granada, Valencia, Castellón, and Vinaròs. Real burials, from the period of Muslim rule itself, not inferred from historical texts or assumed from later population patterns. These medieval Muslim-associated individuals show close to 50% North African ancestry on average, half. That's the number carried by people actually living and buried during Al-Andalus. Set that next to the modern Spanish population, where North African ancestry today sits at roughly 5%. A tenfold drop from that peak medieval level. 10 times lower in the population living on this same land today. That gap confirms something historians had long argued from written records alone, without genetic proof to back it up until now. The Islamization of Iberia involved actual population movement from North Africa. Real people crossing over and settling, not simply the existing Visigothic Roman population converting to a new religion and staying genetically the same. The North African genetic signal in these burials is predominantly Berber in character, tied to Maghreb populations, with a smaller Middle Eastern component layered on top, consistent with the Arab migration that accompanied the larger Berber presence. The gap between roughly 50% then and roughly 5% now is the real question the rest of this story has to answer. Where did the other 45% go? That drop is the mystery in the title. Chasing it means leaving the timeline and following the map instead. The Reconquista wasn't a single event. It was centuries long, and the genetic dilution that followed North African rule tracked that same slow, uneven pace rather than happening all at once. Northern Christian kingdoms held their own territory throughout most of the Islamic period, or reconquered it earliest of anywhere on the peninsula. Those same regions show the lowest North African ancestry in Spain today. The pattern isn't subtle. It's a direct genetic echo of how long, or how briefly, Muslim rule actually touched a given stretch of land. Southern and central regions tell the opposite story. Andalusia, Extremadura, and Castile, the historical heartland of Al-Andalus itself, retain the highest levels of North African genetic ancestry found anywhere in modern Spain. These were the last territories reconquered, and their genetic profile still carries that history centuries later. Portugal offers a useful outside comparison, completing its own reconquest by the mid-13th century. Earlier than most of Spain's southern regions, Portugal shows an intermediate level of North African ancestry, sitting between Spain's north and south. A separate country, a separate timeline, and a genetic result that lines up with it almost precisely. Put together, this means the roughly 5% national average cited earlier is misleading on its own. It's an average, and averages flatten out a real north-south gradient running directly beneath it, a gradient tied to how long each individual region actually stayed under Muslim rule, rather than any single number for the whole country. Even that gradient isn't a clean, uninterrupted line across the map. Later forced population movements reshuffled the pattern further, meaning the geographic decline in ancestry doesn't perfectly track the original conquest and withdrawal on its own. The map explains part of the drop. The rest comes from what happened after 1492, and it's not what people expect. After 1492, Spain expelled its non-Christian populations, Sephardic Jews first, under that year's expulsion order, and later the Moriscos, Muslim converts to Christianity, expelled in the early 1600s. Two separate expulsions, roughly a century apart, both reshaping who remained on the peninsula and who didn't. These expulsions sent people scattering into diasporas across North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and well beyond. But researchers are careful to stress something important here. Leaving didn't erase the genetic contributions these communities had already made to the population before they left. The key modern study on this is Adams et al., published in 2008 in the American Journal of Human Genetics. Researchers analyzed Y chromosome haplotypes in 1,140 males sampled across the Iberian Peninsula and the Balearic Islands. A large, methodologically direct look at what actually remained in the male lineage pool. The result: a mean of 10.6% North African ancestry detected across that sample. That's roughly double the crude 5% figure cited earlier, and the difference comes down to method. This approach isolates specific North African-linked haplogroups directly, rather than averaging broad ancestry estimates across the whole population. There's a second, independent measurement in the same study that backs this up. Haplogroup EM81 shows up at 5.6% frequency across the peninsula. Once that number is adjusted against how common the haplogroup is in North Africa itself, it converts to an estimated 8 to 9% North African contribution, landing close to that same 10.6% figure from a completely different angle. Two separate methods, converging near the same result. That's a strong internal check on the number, not a single study's outlier estimate standing alone. That 10.6% wasn't even the biggest number Adams found in the same dataset. The same 2008 study turned up something researchers hadn't necessarily expected going in. Mean Sephardic Jewish ancestry across those same 1,140 sampled males came out at 19.8%, nearly double the North African figure just covered. Context matters here. Sephardic Jewish communities had lived on the Iberian Peninsula for over a millennium before the 1492 expulsion order, integrated into cities across Spain long before Al-Andalus ever existed as a civilization. This wasn't a recent or brief presence. Genetic analysis of haplotype diversity within the sample suggests the Sephardic component is actually the older of the two lineages measured, meaning it built up gradually, over a longer and earlier stretch of integration than the North African signal did. Researchers frame both proportions, Sephardic and North African together, as evidence of large-scale religious conversion across the population, voluntary in some cases, enforced in others, that absorbed both communities into the general Christian population over successive generations. The implication is direct. The far more mythologized Moorish contribution turns out, by this specific measurement, to be smaller than the far less discussed Jewish one sitting right alongside it in the same dataset. There's another detail worth noting on the North African side specifically. Its geographic spread across the peninsula doesn't mirror where Muslim rule actually lasted the longest. That mismatch points again toward later forced relocations reshaping the picture, rather than a stable historical residue simply sitting where it was originally deposited centuries earlier. So the title's second name, Moorish, turns out not even to be the largest hidden contributor. There's a third population left to place. Spain's genetic landscape isn't uniform across the country, and it was never going to be. Centuries of settlement patterns, geographic isolation, and localized migration sit on top of the national averages already covered, and those local details tell their own separate stories. Andalusia specifically shows elevated North African and Eastern Mediterranean ancestry relative to the rest of Spain, the direct, lasting legacy of serving as the heartland of Moorish Iberia for nearly 800 years of continuous rule. Extremadura and Castile follow a similar pattern. Both were major Al-Andalus territories, and both were among the last regions reconquered by Christian kingdoms, and both show elevated genetic signals that match that extended timeline almost exactly. Cantabria, Asturias, and Galicia sit at the opposite end of the same measurements. These are regions Muslim forces never fully controlled, or held only briefly at most. Genetically, they sit closer to the Basque pattern already covered than to Andalusia's, the low end of the national range, not the high end. Put these regional results together and a genetic gradient emerges, running roughly north to south across the entire peninsula, tracking almost exactly with how long each individual region actually spent under Muslim rule. That gradient isn't a perfectly clean line from top to bottom, though. Pockets of higher or lower ancestry show up in unexpected places, where later population movements, genetic drift, or resettlement disrupted the otherwise steady pattern running through the rest of the map. Two more regions break this map entirely, and neither one is on the mainland. Move northeast, off the steady north-south gradient just described, to Empúries, a Greek colony founded in what is now Catalonia, established somewhere between the 600s BCE and the late Roman period. Analysis of 24 individuals sampled from this site shows that by the start of the Middle Ages, at least a quarter of Iberian ancestry in the region had already been replaced by Eastern Mediterranean gene flow, Romans, Greeks, and Phoenicians combined, all three contributing to the same regional shift. This timeline matters. It predates the Islamic period entirely, meaning Catalonia's genetic mixing with the wider Mediterranean world was already substantial well before 711 CE ever entered the picture. The same broader study sampled two individuals of Visigothic origin from a site in Girona, adding a direct regional data point for the Germanic era layer already covered earlier in this documentary, this time specifically located in Catalonia rather than elsewhere on the peninsula. Ancient Iberians, analyzed across these Mediterranean contact sites, showed a North African genetic component of nearly 50%, set against roughly 5% in the current population, echoing the exact same tenfold collapse already documented in the Islamic period burials from earlier in this story. Catalonia's genetic story, then, runs through Greek and Phoenician contact just as much as it runs through Rome or Islam, a fourth ancient contributor that most people never learn to name when they talk about where Spanish DNA comes from. The Balearic Islands, just off this same coast, tell a version of the story that's stranger still. The Balearic Islands were explicitly included in that same 2008 sampling effort, 1,140 males across the peninsula and the Balearics together, studied as one combined dataset rather than treated as a separate, isolated case. Their inclusion matters for a specific reason. Island populations often show sharper genetic drift than mainland regions, meaning small founder effects can shift ancestry percentages faster and more dramatically than they would across a larger, more connected mainland population. Historically, these islands passed through an unusually dense sequence of ruling powers. Taliatic culture first, then Phoenician Punic control, then Roman rule, then Vandal control, then Byzantine administration, and finally Muslim rule, before Christian reconquest arrived in the 13th century. That's more distinct ruling layers packed into a smaller landmass than almost anywhere else covered on the mainland. Despite that dense stacking of conquest after conquest, the island's modern genetic profile is generally grouped with the broader Iberian range, rather than standing out as its own separate cluster. That result suggests something worth sitting with. Repeated conquest doesn't automatically translate into repeated large-scale genetic replacement. Political control and genetic turnover aren't the same thing. Geography explains part of why these islands sit where they do genetically. Their position functions as a natural stopover point between Iberia, North Africa, and the wider Mediterranean world, making them a natural site for exactly the kind of gene flow already tracked across every other region in this documentary, just compressed onto a much smaller population base. One more island group breaks from everything discussed so far, and it isn't in the Mediterranean at all. The Canary Islands sit out in the Atlantic, off the coast of Morocco, geographically closer to North Africa than to mainland Spain, and genetically their own case entirely, separate from everything else covered up to this point. Ancient DNA sampling of 17 indigenous Guanche individuals drawn across the island's 7 main islands shows North African-related Berber origin. This is a population that arrived on these islands long before Spanish colonization ever began, an entirely separate migration route from anything tied to the 711 CE conquest of the mainland. Spanish colonization, beginning in the 15th century, layered European ancestry on top of this pre-existing Guanche foundation. That's the second distinct layer in the island's genetic history. Later population movement added a further African admixture component on top of both earlier layers, distinct in origin from the original Guanche presence, and arriving on a different timeline entirely. The result is a 3-part ancestral profile unique to these islands: indigenous Berber-related ancestry at the base, colonial European ancestry layered on top, and a later African admixture component layered on top of that. Nothing else covered in this documentary matches that specific 3-part structure. This means the Canary Islands' North African ancestry has nothing to do with the 711 CE conquest discussed earlier in this story. It predates Spanish rule of the islands entirely, and it comes from a migration route completely unrelated to Al-Andalus or the Reconquista. Even inside modern Spain, there's a genetic community stranger and more overlooked than any island so far, and it isn't defined by geography at all. A community-driven genetic study, conducted in partnership with FAGIC, the Federation of Roma Associations of Catalonia, analyzed 173 Spanish Roma volunteers, 133 of them newly genotyped specifically for this project. Researchers examined 27 Y chromosome short tandem repeat markers to assess paternal lineage diversity and geographic substructure within the Spanish Roma population. A detailed, targeted approach built specifically for this community rather than borrowed from broader national studies. The results showed evidence of genetic bottlenecks and distinct founder lineages. Genetic signatures typical of a population that migrated and settled with limited outside gene flow over long stretches of time. The study also detected potential influence from North African and Jewish genetic groups within specific Roma lineages. An unexpected overlap, connecting this population directly to the very genetic threads already covered earlier in this documentary, from a completely separate historical direction. Most prior genetic research on Spanish Roma communities had focused on medical and health-related questions. This project specifically targeted population history and ancestry instead, one of the first efforts to do so at this scale for this particular community. The result makes Spanish Roma genetics a genuinely separate thread inside Spain's national genetic picture, not folded into the north-south Reconquista gradient covered earlier, not explained by Rome, by the Visigoths, or by Al-Andalus at all. A parallel history, running alongside everything else in this documentary rather than through it. Every thread covered in this documentary, Basque, Andalusian, Catalan, Canarian, Roma, comes down to the same underlying mechanism, and it's simpler than it looks. Every major genetic shift covered in this documentary follows the same underlying pattern. The Bronze Age steppe migration, Roman-era Mediterranean contact, Visigothic elite admixture, Islamic period North African gene flow, all of them show small, often male-biased migrant groups mixing into a much larger resident population. Mixing, not replacement. The Bronze Age event stands out as the clear outlier in scale, with its near-total Y chromosome turnover already covered earlier. But even that event left overall autosomal ancestry only about 40% shifted, confirming that mixing, not erasure, remained the dominant mechanism across the entire 8,000-year span this documentary has traced. Ruling elites consistently showed disproportionately high individual ancestry percentages in burial samples. Visigothic nobility, Roman administrators alike. That's not a contradiction of the mixing pattern. It's a product of burial customs themselves, which preserve elite outliers in the archaeological record far more often than they preserve population averages. Regional variation across modern Spain, Basque low, Andalusian high, exists because local population size, geographic isolation, and how long each specific region stayed under a given rule all shaped how much any single migration event could dilute or concentrate over the following centuries. Two independent modern methodologies, haplogroup frequency analysis and broader admixture modeling, keep converging on similar regional numbers. That convergence is exactly why researchers trust the north-south gradient covered earlier as a genuine signal, not statistical noise. The consistent message across every single case in this documentary, from Basques to the Canary Islands to the Spanish Roma, is the same. No single conquest fully explains any region's DNA. Each is a layered sum of migrations, most of them separated from each other by centuries. So the two names in this video's own title were never the real answer. They were just the two most recent chapters. Bronze Age steppe migrants rewrote nearly every male lineage on the peninsula 4,000 years before anyone called this place Spain. That single event outscaled everything that came after it. Rome added a modest, real layer to the genetic record. The Visigoths added a smaller one still, concentrated almost entirely among a ruling elite rather than the broader population beneath them. The Moorish conquest brought the largest single wave of North African ancestry documented anywhere in this historical record, and lost roughly 9/10 of its peak signal over the following centuries of reconquest and expulsion. Sephardic Jewish ancestry, rarely mentioned in the same breath as Moorish Spain, sits at nearly twice the modern genetic level that North African ancestry does. Basques, Canary Islanders, and Spanish Roma, Each carry a genetic history running on an entirely separate track from the north-south Reconquista gradient that everyone else on the peninsula follows. If Rome and the Moors were never really the main story, how many more names are sitting in Spanish DNA that nobody's ever put in a title?